Bristol Cathedral was described by one of the most important architectural historians of the 20th century as superior to anything else in England or Europe. Not for its size, not for its decoration, for the way it uses space, the way it feels to stand inside it. And yet, it broke every conventional building rule. So my question is this: how does a building that breaks every rule end up being praised as the finest in Europe? Some people walk in and feel underwhelmed. It doesn't soar the way other cathedrals soar. They say it's too wide, it's too low, it's not grand enough. I want to show you why every single one of those people is wrong. For 700 years, this was St Augustine's Abbey, founded in 1140 by Robert Fitzhardy, a wealthy Bristol landowner who backed the right side in a civil war and was handsomely rewarded by Henry II. But then, in 1539, Henry VIII dissolved it. And the nave was being rebuilt at the time, but it was never finished. And for 300 years, this cathedral had no nave at all. So, was Nikolaus Pevsner right? Does the way this building used space really surpass anything else in Europe? We need to go in to find out. This is what England had never seen before. Look at the aisles. They're the same height as the nave itself. This is what architects call a hall church, and it doesn't rise above you like Westminster or Canterbury. It opens around you. You feel the width and you feel the space. And because the aisles reach right to the top of the ceiling, the light pours in from every direction. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Something's missing. In every other cathedral, there'd be a row of high windows up there, above the arches, clerestory windows. Here, there's nothing. And after our first hymn, I'll show you why. Because the way they solved that problem is extraordinary. But the reason I chose this hymn is because of two words: light and space. Verse 2, whose robe is the light, whose canopy space. O worship the King, all glorious above. O gratefully sing his power and his love. If you're enjoying this journey through Bristol Cathedral, please do subscribe. There are plenty more of these to come. In any other English cathedral, there'd be a row of high windows up there, clerestory windows letting the light flood in from above. But here, they did something no one else in England had done before. They made the aisles as tall as the nave, which meant no high walls and no clerestory windows. So how do you hold up a stone ceiling with no walls to support it? Well, you build these stone bridges, arches spanning from one side to the other, inside the building, and the stone ceiling sits on top of them. Usually you see this sort of architecture on the outside of the cathedral, flying buttresses pushing against the walls, but here they brought them inside and turned an engineering solution into something beautiful. I think this is one of my favourite choirs of any cathedral. It was a revolutionary design, but we'll explore that in detail later because there's another story I want to tell you first. The space right in front of me here, the nave, well, this is Victorian. For 300 years after Henry VIII dissolved the Abbey, this cathedral had no nave at all. What had been started was demolished, and all that remained was the medieval East End. After the diocese was merged with Gloucester in 1836, people said Bristol had half a bishop and half a cathedral. And for the best part of those 3 centuries, the foundations of the nave supported something rather less devotional. Houses were built right here on the site where the nave should have been, and by 1829, the Dean and Chapter described those houses as very notoriously a receptacle for prostitutes, which is possibly the most polite way anyone's ever said brothel. When the houses were knocked down in 1838, something astonishing was found underneath. The original foundations, untouched, buried for 300 years. But it took one man to do something about it. Canon John Pilkington Norris arrived at the cathedral in 1864, published an open letter to the citizens of Bristol, and within weeks the money started pouring in. 11,000 raised in the first few weeks alone. That's nearly 2 million quid in today's money. The Dean, Gilbert Elliot, thought it would never work. He wanted nothing to do with it, but Norris had Bristol behind him, and there was no stopping it. George Edmund Street was appointed architect, and he found Abbot Newland's original 15th century foundations still intact and decided to finish what the medieval builders had started 300 years later. And that's what made me think of our next hymn, written by Charles Wesley right here in Bristol in 1747. There's a line in the last verse, "Finish then thy new creation," because that's exactly what Street did. He finished the new creation 3 centuries after it was begun. Love divine, all loves excelling, joy of heaven to earth come down. Fix in us thy humble dwelling, all thy faithful mercies crown. Most cathedrals have one Lady Chapel. Bristol has two. Another rule broken. This is the Elder Lady Chapel, built in around 1220. And it's called the Elder quite simply because it's the older of the two. The architect is thought to have been Adam Locke, master mason of Wells Cathedral. And look at these carvings. On this side, we have a monkey playing pipes. Next to him, a ram playing a violin. And on this side, a man with leaves sprouting from his mouth, an ancient pagan symbol of rebirth and new life. Pre-Christian, medieval masons carving the old gods into the new faith, used here to represent Christ's resurrection. But it's the other Lady Chapel that changes everything. And I mean everything.
Full of mercy is your glory, 'cause I'm alive in the love that you gave to my heart, and I let go 'cause I know you are never far away.
The Eastern Lady Chapel was built around 1298 as part of Abbot Noel's revolutionary hall church design. The colours you see were repainted in the 1930s based on fragments of the original medieval palette. This is how it looked 700 years ago, honouring the Virgin Mary. And look at these star-shaped tomb recesses. You won't find anything else quite like them, not in England, not in Europe. But if you do know of any other church with starburst tomb recesses like these, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. Width, space, light, all of it culminating here. Two Lady Chapels, two tributes to the Virgin Mary. This is the heart of what makes Bristol so extraordinary. But coming up, I want to take you outside because the west front of this cathedral has its own extraordinary story. This incredible west front was completed in 1888, over 550 years after the East End was built, designed by John Loughborough Pearson in the French Rayonnement style. And that rose window is another rule broken. English cathedrals don't typically have rose windows. That's French. Spanish. The details up close are clearly English, inspired by Wells and York, but the overall design, continental. These statues in these niches are not the originals. When Street designed the porch, the sculptor James Redfern filled those niches with very different figures. The Virgin Mary at the apex and the Latin doctors of the church, St. Gregory, St. Ambrose, St. Jerome and St. Augustine. They went up in February 1876 and the reaction was immediate and ferocious. Too Catholic, too Romish. Letters flooded the newspapers, and a packed church meeting at the Colston Hall passed a resolution demanding the statues be removed. And Dean Elliot, the man who'd shown no interest in the nave at all, suddenly found his energy. He came racing back from holiday in Italy, and without consulting the architect, without consulting the committee who'd raised all the money, he sent a gang of workmen early one morning and had the statues torn from their niches. The Virgin Mary was badly damaged, but Street rescued the others and sent them to a tiny church in Yorkshire. The entire fundraising committee resigned in protest, and the architect publicly blamed the sculptor for being too injudicious with the Catholic insignia. And James Redfern, the man who'd carved 60 statues on Salisbury Cathedral, found himself abandoned by everyone. He retreated from the project, fell ill, and died later that year. And he was only 38. And the statues you see now, well, they were put there in 1878. The four evangelists, safely biblical safely Protestant. Even the Virgin Mary at the top was replaced with an adoration of the Magi. But there's more. The northwest tower contains 8 bells, and they tell their own story. These bells came from Temple Church in Bristol. On the night of November 24th, 1940, German incendiary bombs rained down on Bristol. Temple Church was gutted by fire and left as an empty shell, which it remains to this day. But the bells survived. And in 1958, they were brought here to the cathedral's northwest tower, rescued from the ruins. Earlier in the Lady Chapels, we saw 2 spaces dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And in the elder Lady Chapel, the entire text of the Magnificat set into glass. Mary's song captured in a window. Well, here's that same song set to music. Tell out, my soul, the greatness of the Lord. Unnumbered blessings, give my spirit voice. Let me show you something most visitors simply walk straight past. The Chapter House, built in around 1160, when Henry II was still on the throne. Some historians call it the finest Norman chapter house still standing in England, and here's why. Look at these arches, pointed. Standing here in 2026, there's nothing out of the ordinary about pointed arches. But in the 1160s, it was revolutionary. This is what architectural historians call the transitional phase. That brief moment between 1145 and 1190, when Norman builders were discovering Gothic, testing pointed arches, and seeing what they could do. These are some of the very first in England. And here's where it gets really interesting. This abbey, as it was back then, wasn't just copying what everyone else was doing. St. Augustine's was a daughter house of the Abbey of St. Victor in Paris, and the first abbot, Richard, recruited directly from St. Victor to establish the community right here. Now, St. Victor wasn't just any monastery. It was one of the great centres of learning in medieval Europe. There were 40 seats built into the niches because every day the Augustinian canons gathered here, sat in those seats, and read a chapter from the Rule of St. Augustine. And that's where the name comes from, chapter house, a chapter a day. In 1831, during the Bristol Reform Bill riots, a mob broke through those windows and made a bonfire of all the Abbey's records. Centuries of history gone. Only the sub-sacrist, William Phillips, armed with an iron bar, prevented them from reaching the church. But when they cleared the rubble and, in the following year, lowered the floor back to the original level, they found something underneath. Something that changes everything we know about this site. And we'll see that in a moment. But standing here and surrounded by these experimental Norman arches, these foundations laid over 860 years ago, I'm reminded of something far older than that, a hymn based on a 7th century Latin text about the one foundation that never crumbles, it never burns, and never falls. Christ is made the sure foundation, Christ the head and cornerstone, chosen of the Lord and precious, binding all the church in one. The choir is always my favourite part of any cathedral, and this one is no exception, especially as there are more rules being broken in here. This choir was built between 1298 and 1332, much of it under Abbot Noel, and the vaulting is like nothing else in England. Most medieval vaults have a ridge rib running along the top, like a spine, but Bristol doesn't. Instead, you get these extraordinary Lierne ribs, creating a pattern of panels that run the entire length of the roof. And here's the genius. Those smooth panels catch the light from the great east window and reflect it back down into the space. So the ceiling itself becomes a source of light. 3 different unique vault designs in this one building, all created under Noel's direction. No one in England, no one in Europe was doing anything like this. And that's what Pevsner was talking about. Not what the building looks like, but what it feels like to be inside. Not just building a ceiling, imagining what light could do inside the room. And then there's this. The case you're looking at dates from 1685, built by Renatus Harris, one of the greatest organ builders in English history. Some of his original pipes are still inside, still speaking after more than 300 years. In 1907, J.W. Walker & Sons completely rebuilt the instruments to fill the new nave and gave it the rich, romantic voice it's had ever since. Walker installed tubular pneumatic action, air pressure through tubes connecting the keys to the pipes. It was the best technology of the day. But that was over 100 years ago, and leather perishes, rubber seals fail, and tubes leak. So by the time Harrison & Harrison began work in 2024, some pipes hadn't spoken properly in decades. So they replaced the entire action from tubular pneumatic to electro-pneumatic. The nervous system of the organ completely renewed while preserving the organ's specification and pipework. A brand new console, rebuilt faithful to the Walker style, with refurbished keyboards, refurbished pistons, stop heads. 19 months of painstaking work. Nearly 4,000 pipes cleaned, repaired and restored, and 5 new stops added. It was rededicated in September 2025. And I came to Bristol specifically to record this wonderful instrument. So if you want to hear it put through its paces, you'll find a full organ recital and organ demonstration by the cathedral's organists right here on Beauty in Sound. But you'll also hear an amazing piece by Eugene Gigout at the end of this video. And if you want to hear the vibrant, exciting tromba on the solo division, I promise you, it's worth the wait. But before that, there's something in the south transept I really want to show you. Remember the riot, the fire? What they found under the chapter house floor? Let me introduce you to the harrowing of hell. This is one of the oldest surviving treasures in the entire cathedral, and possibly the most important. It was found being used as a coffin lid, a Saxon stone carving made around 1050, nearly 1,000 years ago, before any of this even existed. It shows Christ descending into the underworld, but not in darkness, in triumph, breaking down the gates of hell to rescue the souls of the dead. After the 1831 riots damaged the chapter house, the floor had to be lowered back to its original level, and underneath they found this, face down, being used as a coffin lid, buried and forgotten, and then found. That's quite a story of survival, and it's not the only one in this building, because in a moment I'll tell you about one family's story that stretches across 28 generations, and it involves a king's murder. Robert Fitzharding didn't just found this abbey in 1140, he also rebuilt Berkeley Castle, 20 miles north of here. And the family he founded, the Berkeleys, are still there, 28 generations later, still at the castle and still connected to this cathedral. That's an extraordinary span of English history in one family. This is the Berkeley Chapel, but the Berkeleys also have a much darker chapter. In 1327, the deposed King Edward II was placed in the custody of Thomas de Berkeley. He was held prisoner at Berkeley Castle for 5 months. And on the night of September 21st, 1327, Edward was murdered. How exactly, no one knows for certain, but what we do know is that Thomas de Berkeley was charged as an accessory. He claimed it happened while he was away from the castle, and in 1337, he was acquitted. Edward's body was taken to Gloucester Abbey, now Gloucester Cathedral, where his tomb became such a popular site of pilgrimage that the monks were able to rebuild much of the church with the donations. 2 cathedrals from one family. Bristol, they built with devotion. Gloucester, they funded with a murder. And if you want to see more churches like this, with stories like that, please remember to subscribe and click the like button. It really, really does help. That candelabrum dates from 1450, and it came from the Temple Church in Bristol, the same bombed church whose bells now hang in the northwest tower. Another piece of Bristol's history saved from the wreckage. 28 generations of one family, a king's murder, bells, and a candelabrum rescued from the ruins of war. Faith maintained across the centuries through dissolution, riots, and bombing. That's what our next hymn is about. Faith of our fathers, living still in spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy whenever we hear that glorious word. So, how does a building that breaks every rule end up being praised as the finest in Europe? Well, let's count the rules it broke. A whole church with aisles as tall as the nave. No English cathedral had done that before. No clerestory windows, and buttresses on the inside, not outside. 2 Lady chapels instead of 1. A French west front on an English cathedral, built backwards from east to west, finished over 550 years after it was started by Victorian architects using the medieval plans, with bells rescued from a bombed Templar church and a candelabrum saved from the same ruins. This building should be a mess, a patchwork of compromises and contradictions, but it's not. And Pevsner, I think, put his finger on exactly why. He didn't praise its decoration, he didn't praise its size, he praised the way it feels to be inside, the way the medieval builders imagined what a church could feel like. Not tall and narrow, forcing your eyes upwards, but wide and open, drawing you in. Not a building that towers over you, but a building that holds you. Every rule they broke in service of that idea. It started in the chapter house with those pointed arches that no one in England had tried before. That light could come in from everywhere. That the ceiling could glow. That a church could feel less like a fortress and more as an embrace. Breaking rules wasn't a rebellion, it was something closer to love. Bristol Cathedral, the finest hall church in Britain, and, in the considered opinion of Nikolaus Pevsner, from the point of view of spatial imagination at least, superior to anything else in England, and indeed Europe. And I am inclined to agree.